Picture this, April 2024. Hundreds of drones and ballistic missiles streak across the night sky over the Middle East. Iran has just launched its first ever direct military strike against Israel. Air raid sirens scream across the country. Families rush to shelters. The Iron Dome lights up the darkness like a violent thunderstorm. The whole world holds its breath. News anchors scramble to explain what's happening. Social media explodes. World leaders issue urgent statements. And everyone watching assumes the same thing. This is how it's always been. Iran hates Israel. Israel hates Iran. That's the story. End of discussion. Except that's not the story. Not even close. Because if you actually open the Bible, what you find between these two nations is the exact opposite of what any headline in the last 45 years would lead you to believe. The land we now call Iran wasn't Israel's enemy. For centuries, across multiple kings and multiple empires, it was one of the most important allies the Jewish people ever had. And not just an ally in the background, front and center, again and again and again. Ancient Persia, the civilization that rose from the exact same mountains and plateaus that modern Iran sits on today, didn't just coexist with Israel. It rescued them, funded their temple, freed them from captivity, protected their prophets, armed their leaders, honored their God. And if many scholars are right, it even sent wise men across 1,000 miles of desert to worship a Jewish baby in a feeding trough. This isn't a footnote in scripture. It's one of the major themes of the Old Testament's final act, and almost nobody talks about it. So today we're going to walk through every time Iran helped Israel in the Bible. Not just the surface-level Sunday school version, but the details that make these stories hit different when you realize what was actually happening. And then we're going to talk about why it stopped, because that story is just as important and just as surprising. Let's get into it. First, let's connect the dots that most people miss. When the Bible says Persia, it's talking about Iran, not a country near Iran, not a culture influenced by Iran. Iran. The Persian Empire rose from the Iranian plateau. Its greatest cities, Susa, Persepolis, Ecbatana, Pasargadae, are all located in present-day Iran. You can visit the ruins today. The people who built that empire, the Achaemenids, spoke Old Persian, an ancestor of modern Farsi. The culture, the traditions, the bloodlines, they flow directly into what we now call Iranian civilization. So when you read about Cyrus or Darius or Xerxes in your Bible, you're reading about Iranian kings ruling from Iranian soil. That's not interpretation. That's geography. And Iranians know this. Modern Iran takes enormous pride in its Persian heritage. The ruins of Persepolis are a national treasure. Cyrus the Great is considered a founding figure of Iranian identity. His legacy belongs to them. So when we talk about what Persia did for Israel in the Bible, we're talking about the ancestors of the Iranian people doing it from Iranian land. The connection isn't abstract, it's direct. And here's why that matters. Because it means the Bible has a lot more to say about Iran than most people think, and almost all of it is positive. Shockingly, dramatically positive. In fact, you could argue that no Gentile nation in all of Scripture plays a more redemptive role in Israel's story than Persia does. Not one. Let's start with a moment that sets the whole thing in motion. And honestly, it's one of the most jaw-dropping prophecies in all of Scripture. Number 1. God names a Persian king 150 years before he's born and calls him Messiah. The prophet Isaiah is writing during a dark time. The northern kingdom of Israel has already fallen to Assyria. The southern kingdom of Judah is hanging by a thread, and Isaiah is seeing visions of what's coming. Exile, destruction, the temple in ruins, Jerusalem burned, everything the people of God have built, gone. But then, right in the middle of all that darkness, God says something that would have sounded absolutely insane to anyone listening. He names a king, a specific individual king. Not a Jewish king, not a descendant of David, a Persian, a foreigner, a man who won't even be born for another century and a half. Isaiah 44:28. God says of Cyrus, "He is my shepherd, and he shall fulfill all my purpose. Saying of Jerusalem, she shall be built. And of the temple, your foundation shall be laid." The temple hasn't even been destroyed yet when Isaiah writes this. Jerusalem is still standing, but God is already looking past the destruction, past the exile, past 70 years of captivity in Babylon, and he's pointing to a man who doesn't exist yet and saying that's the one who's going to fix it. But it gets even more stunning. Isaiah 45:1. Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped, to subdue nations before him, and to loose the belts of kings, to open doors before him that gates may not be closed. His anointed. In Hebrew, that's Mashiach, Messiah. That is the most sacred political and spiritual title in all of Jewish theology. It was reserved for the kings of Israel, the ones God himself had chosen and set apart. Priests could receive it. Prophets could carry echoes of it. But in its fullest sense, Mashiach was the king, the one God placed on the throne to rule on his behalf. It was the word that would eventually be applied to Jesus Christ himself. Christ is just the Greek translation of Mashiach, anointed one, and God gives that title to a Persian, an Iranian. Let the weight of that settle. In a culture where the messianic hope was the hope, the thing that held the entire national identity together, God takes that word and attaches it to an outsider, a pagan king, a man who worships different gods and rules a foreign empire. The Jewish exiles hearing this for the first time would have been stunned, maybe offended, definitely confused. How can our God call a foreigner his Messiah? But that's exactly what he does, and no other foreigner in the entire Bible receives it. Not Nebuchadnezzar, who God also used. Not Pharaoh, not Alexander, not Caesar, only Cyrus, only this one Iranian king. And here's the part that makes it even more interesting. The text doesn't pretend Cyrus is a believer. Twice, God says it plainly. Though you do not know me, Cyrus doesn't worship Yahweh. He doesn't follow the Torah. He doesn't even know who this God is. But God chooses him anyway, grasps his right hand anyway, calls him by name anyway. Some ancient Jewish historians, including Josephus, believe that when Cyrus eventually conquered Babylon, someone actually showed him the scroll of Isaiah, that someone may have been Daniel himself, who was serving as a high-ranking official in the Persian government at the time. Imagine that. A Persian king, freshly victorious over the greatest empire on earth, unrolling a Jewish scroll and reading his own name in a prophecy written before his grandfather was alive. Whether or not that specific moment happened exactly that way, what did happen next is a matter of historical record, both biblical and secular. Number 2, Cyrus conquers Babylon and sets the Jewish people free. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what exile felt like. Because we throw that word around in church like it's just a chapter heading, but for the people living through it, exile was the end of the world. In 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian army broke through the walls of Jerusalem. They burned the temple, the house of God, the place where his presence dwelled on earth. They tore down the city walls. They killed the king's sons in front of him, then gouged out his eyes so that the last thing he ever saw was his children dying. Then they marched the surviving population hundreds of miles east to Babylon. Everything was gone. The land God promised Abraham? Gone. The throne God promised David? Gone. The temple Solomon built with gold and cedar and years of devotion. Ashes. Psalm 137 captures it. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows there we hung up our harps, for there our captors required of us songs, saying, Sing us one of the songs of Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? That's not poetry for poetry's sake. That's the sound of a people who believe God has abandoned them. 70 years they sat in that grief. An entire generation was born, grew old, and died without ever seeing home. Children who had never seen Jerusalem heard their grandparents whisper about it, like a dream they couldn't quite remember. And then Persia rose. Cyrus the Great came down from the Iranian highlands like a force of nature. He conquered the Medes. He conquered the Lydians. And in 539 BC, he conquered Babylon itself. The greatest empire the world had ever known fell to a Persian king. And Cyrus didn't burn it down. He walked in almost peacefully. The Babylonian chronicles record that the city surrendered without a fight. But here's where the story turns. Because most conquerors in the ancient world would have just absorbed the captive populations into their own empire. That's what Babylon did. That's what Assyria did. You lose, you disappear. Your culture gets swallowed. Your gods get forgotten. Cyrus did the opposite. He issued a decree. The book of Ezra records it. 2 Chronicles records it. And we even have a secular version of it on the famous Cyrus cylinder, a clay artifact discovered in the ruins of Babylon in 1879 that's now sitting in the British Museum. Cyrus declared that captive peoples throughout the Babylonian Empire were free to return to their homelands and rebuild their temples. For the Jews, the decree was specific. Ezra 1 records that Cyrus acknowledged the Lord, the God of heaven, and said God had charged him to build a house in Jerusalem. He told the Jewish exiles they could go home. But he didn't stop there. He returned over 5,400 gold and silver vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had looted from Solomon's temple, sacred objects. Bowls, basins, censers, items used in the worship of God, sitting in a Babylonian storeroom for 70 years. Cyrus gave them all back, and he ordered the surrounding peoples to support the returning Jews with silver, gold, goods, livestock and free will offerings. This is a Persian king, an Iranian king, paying out of pocket to restore the worship of a god he didn't even follow. Fulfilling a prophecy he may not have fully understood, setting in motion the return that the Jewish people had been crying out for since the day they were dragged from their homes. And here's the thing, we don't just have the Bible's word for this. In 1879, archaeologists excavating the ruins of Babylon discovered a clay cylinder about the size of a football, covered in ancient cuneiform script. It's called the Cyrus cylinder, and it records Cyrus's own account of conquering Babylon and freeing captive peoples to return to their homelands and rebuild their temples. It doesn't mention the Jews by name. It's a broader policy declaration, but it confirms exactly what the Bible describes. Cyrus presented himself as a liberator, not a destroyer. He restored sacred objects. He funded rebuilding. He let people go home. The Cyrus cylinder is now in the British Museum. Some historians have called it the world's first charter of human rights. Whether or not that's an overstatement, here's what isn't. The Bible and secular archaeology agree on this one. A Persian king freed the Jewish people and gave them everything they needed to start over. The evidence is written in scripture and carved in clay. Both tell the same story. And just like that, the exile was over. Not because Israel fought its way out, not because a Jewish army rose up, but because God moved the heart of an Iranian. Number 3. Darius I finds the receipts and bankrolls the temple. So the Jews go home. They lay the foundation of the new temple. The older generation weeps because they remember the glory of Solomon's temple, and this doesn't compare. The younger generation shouts for joy because they've never seen a temple at all. It's a messy, emotional, beautiful moment. But almost immediately, trouble shows up. The local populations, people who had moved into the land while the Jews were gone, don't want them there. They see this rebuilding project as a threat, so they start interfering, first with intimidation, then with political maneuvering. They write letters to the Persian court accusing the Jews of sedition, basically saying these people have a history of rebellion. If you let them rebuild their city, they'll stop paying taxes and revolt. And for a while, it works. The rebuilding stalls. For years, the half-finished temple just sits there. The people get discouraged. They start focusing on their own houses instead. The prophets Haggai and Zechariah have to show up just to remind them why they came back in the first place. Then a new king takes the throne, Darius I, and the local officials try the same move again. They write to Darius and say, "These Jews claim King Cyrus gave them permission to do this. We have no record of that. You should investigate." Now here's where it gets good. Because Darius does investigate. He orders a search of the royal archives, and they find the scroll. Cyrus's original decree, stored in the citadel of Ecbatana, every word confirmed, permission to rebuild. Specific dimensions for the temple, expenses to be paid from the royal treasury. But Darius doesn't just say, "Okay, carry on." He goes further than Cyrus did. He issues his own decree, and it's fierce. He commands the governor and officials to stay completely away from the Jews and let them work. He orders that the full cost of the rebuilding be paid from the royal tax revenue of the province, not Jewish money, Persian money, Iranian money. He commands that whatever the priests need for sacrifices, young bulls, rams, lambs, wheat, salt, wine, oil, it should be given to them day by day without fail. Without fail. Those are his exact words. And then he adds a warning that sounds like it came from an action movie. Anyone who alters this decree will have a beam ripped from their own house, and they'll be impaled on it. And their house will be turned into a dunghill. That's not diplomatic language. That's a Persian king saying, touch God's temple project, and I will personally end you. Ezra 6 records that the temple was completed and dedicated with joy. The Jewish people celebrated the Passover for the first time in their rebuilt homeland, and Ezra makes a point of noting why it happened. Because the Lord had turned the heart of the king of Assyria, using an old title for the region, to strengthen their hands in the work. God turned his heart. That's the pattern. God keeps reaching into the halls of Persian power and turning hearts that don't even know they're being turned. Number 4. Daniel is promoted, protected, and elevated under Persian kings. Now we need to rewind a little, because one of the most famous stories in the Bible happens during this same Persian period, and it reveals something important about how Persia treated the Jewish people, not just as a policy, but personally. Daniel had been taken from Jerusalem as a teenager during the very first wave of Babylonian deportation. He'd spent his entire life serving foreign kings. He interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dreams. He read the writing on the wall for Belshazzar. He was old by the time Persia took over, decades in exile. And yet, when the new Persian administration was set up, Daniel wasn't retired or sidelined. He was promoted. Daniel chapter 6 says he was appointed one of 3 chief administrators over the entire kingdom. And he so outperformed the others that King Darius, likely Darius the Mede who served under Cyrus, planned to put Daniel in charge of the whole empire. Let that sink in. A Jewish exile, a man from a conquered people. And the Persian king wants to make him prime minister. But success breeds jealousy. The other officials can't find any dirt on Daniel. No corruption, no incompetence, nothing. So they target his faith. They convince the king to sign an irrevocable decree. For 30 days, no one can pray to any god or man except the king. Anyone who violates this gets thrown into a den of lions. Daniel hears about the decree. He goes home. He opens his window toward Jerusalem, just like always, and he prays. 3 times a day, on his knees. He doesn't hide, he doesn't negotiate, he doesn't ask for an exemption. He just prays. They catch him. They bring him before the king. And here's what's remarkable. Darius is devastated. The text says he was deeply distressed and worked until sundown trying to find a legal loophole to save Daniel. This isn't a king who's indifferent. This is a Persian ruler who genuinely cares about a Jewish man's life. But the law of the Medes and Persians cannot be revoked. Even the king can't undo it. So Daniel goes into the den. Darius says to him, and this is the king of Persia speaking, "May your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you." Then a stone is placed over the mouth of the den, and the king goes back to his palace where he spends the entire night fasting. He can't eat, he can't sleep, he dismisses the entertainment. He just waits. At dawn, he rushes to the den, and he calls out, his voice probably breaking, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God been able to rescue you from the lions?" And from the darkness, Daniel answers, "He's alive. Not a scratch on him." God sent an angel to shut the lions' mouths. What happens next is extraordinary. Darius pulls Daniel out, throws the conspirators in instead, and then issues a decree to the entire Persian Empire. Every nation, every people, every language. He commands them all to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. He declares that God is the living God who endures forever, that his kingdom will never be destroyed, that he rescues and saves and performs signs and wonders. A Persian king, writing theology, broadcasting it across the largest empire on earth, because a Jewish man prayed with his window open. Daniel chapter 6 ends simply. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. He didn't just survive Persia, he thrived in it. And Persia was better for having him. And there's a ripple effect here that goes further than most people realize. Daniel didn't just serve in the Persian government, he influenced it. He shaped how the most powerful people in the empire thought about God, about prophecy, about the future. Remember, Daniel had been placed over the wise men, the Magi of both Babylon and Persia. He was their chief, he had their ear, and he had received visions from God about a coming eternal kingdom, about a son of man who would be given dominion over all nations and peoples and languages. Visions about a future ruler whose kingdom would never be destroyed. These weren't private thoughts that Daniel kept in a journal. He recorded them, he taught them, and in a culture where priestly traditions were passed down through generations with meticulous care, Those teachings didn't vanish when Daniel died. They were preserved, remembered, possibly studied by Persian priest scholars for centuries after his death. Keep that detail in your mind, because we're going to come back to it later in a way that might give you chills. Number 5. A Persian king and a Jewish queen stop a genocide. If there's one story that captures the full drama of Iran's biblical relationship with Israel, it's this one. Because the Book of Esther has everything. Political intrigue, a genocidal plot, a brave woman, a foolish king, a villain who builds his own gallows, and God working behind the scenes so quietly that his name is never even mentioned. The setting is the Persian court under King Xerxes, known in Hebrew as Ahasuerus. This is the same Xerxes who launched the massive invasion of Greece, the one the movie 300 is loosely based on. He rules an empire that stretches from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces, and scattered throughout that empire are Jewish communities, descendants of those who didn't return to Jerusalem when Cyrus gave them the chance. The story begins with a banquet. Xerxes throws a lavish party that lasts 180 days. He's showing off his wealth and power. At the climax, he summons Queen Vashti to display her beauty before his guests. She refuses. The king is humiliated. His advisors tell him he needs to make an example of her, or every wife in the empire will start defying her husband. So Vashti is removed, and the search begins for a new queen. Enter Esther, a young Jewish woman, an orphan, raised by her cousin Mordecai. She's beautiful, but she's also a nobody, a member of a minority population living in a foreign land. She has no power, no connections, no reason to be anywhere near the throne. But she enters the king's selection process, and out of all the women in the empire, Xerxes chooses her. She becomes queen of Persia, and on Mordecai's advice, she keeps her Jewish identity hidden. Now, here's where the tension builds. A man named Haman rises to become the king's most powerful advisor. He's an Agagite, which many scholars connect to the ancient Amalekites, a people who had been enemies of Israel since the days of Moses. Haman is proud. He expects everyone to bow when he passes. And everyone does, except Mordecai. The text says Mordecai refused to bow. He wouldn't do it. This infuriates Haman. But going after one man isn't enough. When Haman learns Mordecai is Jewish, he decides to destroy all the Jews in the entire Persian Empire. Every man, every woman, every child, a complete extermination. He goes to the king with a carefully worded proposal. He says there's a certain people scattered throughout the empire whose customs are different and who don't obey the king's laws. He suggests they be destroyed, and he offers to pay 10,000 talents of silver into the royal treasury to fund it. Xerxes agrees. He hands Haman his signet ring. The decree goes out in the king's name, sealed, irrevocable. On the 13th day of the 12th month, every Jew in the empire is to be killed, their property seized. Mordecai hears. He tears his clothes, puts on sackcloth and ashes, and wails in the streets. When word reaches Esther inside the palace, she's terrified. Mordecai sends her a message. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. If you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? For such a time as this. That line has echoed through history, because it reveals the whole theology of the Book of Esther without ever saying God's name. Everything that happened, Vashti's refusal, Esther's selection, Mordecai's position at the gate, it all looks like coincidence. But it's not. It's providence. God positioned a Jewish woman in the most powerful court on earth for this exact moment. Esther makes her decision. She tells Mordecai to gather all the Jews in Susa to fast for 3 days. No food, no water. And then she says the words that define courage in Scripture. I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. She approaches the throne uninvited, which could mean instant death. But the king extends his golden scepter. She's received. She doesn't blurt out her request. She's strategic. She invites the king and Haman to a banquet. Then another banquet. She builds the moment. Meanwhile, God is working in ways no one can see. That very night, the king can't sleep. He asks for the royal records to be read to him, and the passage they happen to read is the account of how Mordecai once saved the king's life by exposing an assassination plot. The king realizes Mordecai was never honored for this. The next morning he asks Haman, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Haman, thinking the king means him, describes an elaborate public parade. The king says, great, do all of that for Mordecai the Jew. Haman is forced to lead his own enemy through the streets in triumph. He goes home humiliated. And the hits keep coming. At the second banquet, Esther finally reveals her identity and exposes the plot. If I have found favor in your sight, O king, let my life be granted me, and let my people be spared, for we have been sold, I and my people to be destroyed. The king is furious. Who would dare to do this? He demands. Esther points at Haman, a foe and enemy. This wicked Haman. Haman throws himself at Esther's feet to beg for mercy. The king returns and sees Haman falling onto the couch, where Esther is reclining, and assumes the worst. Within minutes, Haman is hanged on the very gallows he built for Mordecai, 75 feet high. The instrument of his hatred becomes the instrument of his destruction. But the story's not over. The original decree can't be revoked, so the king issues a new one. He gives the Jews permission to defend themselves, to fight back, to stand their ground against anyone who attacks them. And when the 13th day comes, the Jewish people not only survive, they prevail, overwhelmingly. The Feast of Purim was established to commemorate this deliverance. Jewish communities still celebrate it to this day. They read the entire scroll of Esther aloud. They cheer at Mordecai's name and boo at Haman's. They eat and drink and give gifts to the poor. And they remember that when extinction seemed certain, deliverance came from inside the Persian court. Once again, it's Iran. Its Persian power turned to Jewish protection. A king who didn't know God, a queen who did, and a plot that unraveled not through military might, but through courage, timing, and the invisible hand of a God who never abandoned his people even when they couldn't hear his voice. Number 6. Artaxerxes funds and empowers Ezra to restore Jewish law. Now the temple is rebuilt. The people are back in the land. You'd think the story would shift toward triumph, right? The exile is over. The building is done. Time to celebrate. But that's not what happens, because physical restoration doesn't automatically fix what's broken on the inside. The Jewish community in Jerusalem is struggling, not with bricks and mortar, but with identity. They're intermarrying with the surrounding nations, something the law explicitly warned against because of the spiritual compromise it would bring. The Sabbath is being neglected. The sacrificial system is functioning, but the hearts behind it are hollow. They look like God's people on the outside, but they're drifting. They have a temple, but they've lost their way. This is actually one of the most relatable moments in the entire biblical story. How many times has someone been brought back from a hard place, given a second chance, had everything rebuilt, and still found themselves slowly slipping? Freedom from captivity doesn't automatically produce faithfulness. That takes something deeper. Enter Ezra, a priest, a scribe, a man the Bible describes as having set his heart to study the law of the Lord, and to do it, and to teach it in Israel. Notice the order. Study, do, teach. Ezra isn't a hypocrite with a clipboard. He lives what he teaches, and he's about to receive something extraordinary from a Persian king. Artaxerxes, the next in the line of Persian rulers, writes Ezra a letter, and it's not a brief note, it's a royal charter. Ezra chapter 7 records it in detail, and honestly, if you've never read it closely, you should, because what this Persian king gives a Jewish priest is staggering. First, he authorizes Ezra to lead any willing Jews from Babylon to Jerusalem. He's not forcing anyone to go, but anyone who wants to can, and they have the king's backing. Second, he gives Ezra silver and gold from the royal treasury. The amounts are significant. Up to 100 talents of silver, up to 100 cors of wheat, up to 100 baths of wine, up to 100 baths of oil, and salt without limit. This isn't a token donation. This is massive state funding for the restoration of Jewish worship. Third, and this is the one that should really make you stop and think, he gives Ezra governmental authority. He tells him to appoint magistrates and judges to govern all the people in the province who know the laws of God. And anyone who doesn't know those laws should be taught. Then he adds enforcement. Anyone who doesn't obey the law of Ezra's God and the law of the king will be punished. Death, banishment, confiscation of goods, or imprisonment. A Persian king, an Iranian king, giving a Jewish priest the legal authority to enforce the Torah in an entire region of the empire. funding it, backing it with the threat of state punishment. Ezra's response is recorded in verse 27. "Blessed be the Lord, the God of our fathers, who put such a thing as this into the heart of the king, to beautify the house of the Lord that is in Jerusalem." Ezra doesn't credit politics, he credits God. He says God put it into the king's heart, the same pattern, over and over. God reaching into Persian power, turning hearts, using kings who don't know him to accomplish things they can't fully comprehend. Number 7. Artaxerxes arms Nehemiah to rebuild the walls. 13 years after Ezra's mission, another Jewish man stands before the same Persian king. But this time, the request is different, and the way it happens is deeply personal. Nehemiah is the king's cupbearer. That's not a servant who pours drinks. In the ancient Persian court, the cupbearer was one of the most trusted people in the kingdom. He tasted the king's wine to make sure it wasn't poisoned. He had daily intimate access to the most powerful man on earth. It was a position of enormous trust and influence. One day, Nehemiah receives a report from Jerusalem. His brother and some other men have just arrived from Judah, and the news is devastating. The people who survived the exile and returned to the province are in great trouble. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down. Its gates have been burned with fire. Nehemiah sits down and weeps. He mourns for days. He fasts. He prays. And when he finally appears before the king, his grief is written all over his face. Artaxerxes notices immediately. He says, "Why is your face sad, seeing you are not sick?" This is nothing but sadness of heart. The text says Nehemiah was very afraid, because showing sadness in the king's presence could be interpreted as disloyalty or ingratitude. But he tells the truth. "Why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" The king asks, "What are you requesting?" Before he answers the king of Persia, he prays, silently, quickly, a prayer shot straight up to heaven in the space between one sentence and the next. Then he makes his request. He asks to go to Jerusalem and rebuild. Artaxerxes says yes, but not just yes. He gives Nehemiah letters to the governors of the provinces beyond the river, granting him safe passage through their territories. He gives him a letter to the keeper of the king's forest, ordering him to provide timber for the gates of the fortress by the temple, for the city wall, and for Nehemiah's own house. And he sends army officers and horsemen as a military escort, a Persian king, providing lumber, letters, and a military guard for a Jewish cupbearer to go rebuild the walls of a distant city. Not because it benefited Persia strategically, but because a man he trusted was hurting and the king wanted to help. Nehemiah arrives. He surveys the walls at night, alone on a donkey, riding through rubble and ruin, assessing the damage by moonlight. The destruction is worse than he imagined. Gates charred to nothing. Walls collapsed into heaps of stones so thick his donkey can barely pass through. This isn't just a building project, it's a resurrection. Then he gathers the people and tells them what the king has done. He tells them about the hand of God that was upon him. Their response? Let us rise up and build. And they do. Families take responsibility for sections of the wall near their own homes. Priests, goldsmiths, perfume makers, people who've never held a trowel in their lives, they all show up and start working. But the enemies notice immediately. Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite mock them first. What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of rubbish? Tobiah adds, if a fox goes up on what they're building, it'll break down their stone wall. The mockery stings, but Nehemiah prays and keeps building. When mockery doesn't work, the enemies escalate. They plot a military attack. Nehemiah responds by arming the workers. Half the men work while the other half stand guard with spears, shields, and bows. The builders themselves carry a sword at their side while they lay stone with their other hand. Nehemiah tells them, do not be afraid. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes. They work from dawn until the stars come out. They don't even take off their clothes except to wash. 52 days. That's how long it takes. The wall is finished. The city is secure. And when the surrounding nations hear about it, the text says they lose their confidence, because they recognize that this work was accomplished with the help of God, but it was also accomplished with the help of Persia. Again. Number 8. Persian wise men travel to worship the newborn king of Israel. We've covered 7 moments from the Old Testament, 7 times where Persian kings and Persian power served God's purposes for Israel. But there's one more, and it takes us into the New Testament, into the opening pages of the Gospel of Matthew, into one of the most famous scenes in all of Christian history, Matthew 2. Jesus has been born in Bethlehem. It's a quiet birth in an obscure town, no royal announcement, no military fanfare, just a young couple, a manger, and a baby who happens to be God in the flesh. Nobody important seems to notice, except that wise men show up from the east, and when you dig into who these men actually were, the story takes on an entirely new dimension. The Greek word Matthew uses is magoi. Magi, most English translations say wise men, but that's vague. In the ancient world, magi referred to a very specific class of people. They were a hereditary caste of priest-scholars originally from the Median tribe in northern Iran. Over centuries, they became the priestly and intellectual elite of the Persian Empire. They were experts in astronomy, dream interpretation, and religious ritual. They were closely associated with Zoroastrianism, the dominant religion of ancient Persia, and they held enormous political power. In the Parthian Empire, which had inherited Persia's territory by the time of Jesus, the Magi sat on a council that had the authority to select and approve new kings. Let me say that again. These weren't just stargazers. They were kingmakers. They decided who sat on the throne of the most powerful empire east of Rome. Now, the Parthian Empire in the 1st century was centered on modern-day Iran and Iraq. It was Rome's greatest rival. The two empires had been clashing for decades over territory in the Middle East, and Israel was caught right in the middle. In fact, the Parthians had briefly controlled Jerusalem itself about 35 years before Jesus was born. So when Matthew says wise men came from the east, his 1st century audience would have understood exactly what that meant. Powerful men, Persian men, men connected to the Iranian ruling class. And they arrived in Roman-occupied Jerusalem, asking a question that would have sent chills down Herod's spine. Where is he who has been born king of the Jews? This wasn't a casual inquiry. Coming from Parthian Magi, this was geopolitically explosive. These were representatives of Rome's greatest enemy walking into Rome's client kingdom, asking about a rival king. No wonder Matthew says that when Herod heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. The whole city was afraid, because this wasn't just a religious event. It had political implications that could start a war. Some scholars believe the Magi's knowledge of a coming Jewish king traced back centuries, back to Daniel, because Daniel had served as the chief of the wise men in both Babylon and Persia. He had access to the Magi, he had their respect, and he had received visions about a coming eternal kingdom and a ruler who would be given dominion over all nations. It's possible, even likely, that Daniel's teachings were preserved among the Magi for generations, passed down through centuries of Persian tradition, kept alive in a priestly class that watched the stars and waited for a sign. Remember earlier when I said to keep Daniel's influence on the Magi in mind? Here's the payoff. Daniel 9 contains one of the most precise messianic prophecies in the Bible, a timeline pointing to exactly when the Anointed One would come. If Daniel shared that with the priestly class he led, and if they preserved it the way they preserved everything else, then those Magi didn't just see a random star and get curious. They may have been counting the years, waiting for a prophecy they'd inherited from a Jewish exile who served among their ancestors 5 centuries earlier. The star was the signal, but Daniel may have been the reason they knew to look for it in the first place. And when the sign finally came, they didn't hesitate. They assembled what was probably a significant caravan. These weren't 3 guys on camels, despite what every nativity scene suggests. Parthian Magi traveling through Roman territory would have needed protection, a military escort, probably a cavalry guard of hundreds, possibly 1,000 horsemen. This was a diplomatic and religious expedition from the heart of Rome's greatest rival, moving through contested territory, heading straight for the capital of Rome's client kingdom. The logistics alone would have taken months to arrange. So when Matthew says wise men came from the east, picture it properly: a massive procession of Persian nobility, armed guards, and priestly scholars riding through Roman-controlled land, arriving at the gates of Jerusalem, and asking publicly, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? Not where is the current king, where is the one who has been born king? They're not asking about Herod, they're announcing that someone else holds the title. No wonder Herod was terrified. No wonder all Jerusalem was troubled with him. This wasn't a friendly visit. This was a potential political crisis. Parthian kingmakers in Roman territory looking for a rival monarch. The tension in that room must have been suffocating, but Herod played it cool. He called the Magi privately. He asked when the star had appeared. He told them to go find the child and report back, so that he too could come and worship. Of course, Herod had no intention of worshipping. He wanted the child dead. But the Magi didn't know that yet. They followed the star. It led them to Bethlehem, to a house, not a palace, not a fortress, a house in one of the smallest towns in Judea. And when they found the child with Mary his mother, they fell down and worshipped him. Not a quick nod, not a diplomatic greeting. They fell down. These were men of power and prestige, men who chose kings for a living, men who had travelled for months across brutal terrain, and they hit the ground in front of a toddler in a peasant house. Then they opened their treasures. Gold, the gift of kings, a declaration that this child was royalty. Frankincense, the gift of priests, an acknowledgement that this child was divine. Myrrh, a resin used in burial preparation, a haunting foreshadowing, whether they knew it or not, that this king would suffer and die. These weren't random luxury items. They were prophetic gifts. Each one said something about who this child was and what he came to do. And then something curious happens. God warns them in a dream not to return to Herod, so they depart for their own country by another route. They slip away, they protect the child by vanishing, and they are never mentioned in Scripture again. Persian wise men appear at the birth of the Jewish Messiah, worship him, arm him with royal gifts, shield him from a murderous king, and disappear into the east like a whisper. Persian wise men, bowing before the King of Kings. It's the last time in all of Scripture that the land of Persia reaches out to bless the story of Israel. And it might be the most beautiful moment of all, the pattern behind the pattern. So let's step back and look at what we've just walked through. 8 moments, 8 examples of the land we now call Iran, acting as an instrument of blessing for the people of Israel. A king named before birth and called Messiah. An empire that freed an entire people from captivity. A treasury that funded the rebuilding of God's temple. A court that protected and promoted a prophet of God. A queen who stopped a genocide. A royal decree that empowered the restoration of God's law. A king who sent lumber, soldiers, and safe passage to rebuild a broken city. And wise men who crossed a continent to worship a newborn king. That's not a coincidence. That's a pattern, and the pattern has a spine. Because in nearly every one of these stories, God is working through someone who doesn't fully know him. Cyrus didn't know God. The text says so twice. Darius acknowledged God after seeing Daniel's deliverance, but he wasn't a convert. Artaxerxes funded Jewish worship, but he remained a Persian king with Persian gods. Even the Magi were Zoroastrian priests from a completely different religious tradition, and yet God used them all. He turned their hearts. He guided their decisions. He put people in position, Esther in a palace, Daniel in a government, Nehemiah at the king's side, and then he moved the kings to act in ways that served his purposes. That's the theology of this whole story. God is not limited by who knows him. His sovereignty extends over every throne, every empire, every ruler. The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. He directs it like a watercourse wherever he pleases. That's Proverbs 21:1. And Persia is the living proof. Think about what that means practically. It means a king can wake up one morning and feel compelled to search through old archives for a scroll he's never read. It means a ruler can look at a sad cupbearer and feel something in his heart shift. It means a council of priest astronomers can look at the sky, see a light they've never seen before, and feel a pull so strong they pack up their lives and ride 1,000 miles to follow it. None of these men could have articulated what was happening, but something was happening. God was moving, quietly, relentlessly, through people who didn't have the categories to name what they were participating in. And that should encourage anyone who thinks God can only work through believers, through churches, through people who have it all figured out. Because the Persia story says otherwise. God used a pagan king to free his people, a Zoroastrian priest class to worship his son, a secular empire to fund his temple. If God can turn the heart of Cyrus, he can turn anyone's heart, anywhere, at any time. No other Gentile nation in the Bible has a record like this. Egypt enslaved Israel. Babylon destroyed them. Assyria scattered them. Rome crucified their Messiah. But Persia set them free. Persia rebuilt what others destroyed. Persia funded what others burned. Persia protected what others tried to exterminate. Every other major empire in Israel's story shows up as an antagonist at some point. Persia never does. Not once. So how did we get from there to here? Why it stopped? The answer isn't simple. And it didn't happen all at once. In fact, for most of the centuries between the biblical period and the modern era, the relationship between Persian civilization and the Jewish people continued in a remarkably positive direction. For centuries after the biblical period, the story actually continued in the same direction. Jews thrived in the Persian and later Parthian and Sassanid empires. Major Jewish academies operated in Babylon, which was under Persian cultural influence, and they produced the Babylonian Talmud, one of the most important texts in Jewish history. Think about that. The Talmud, a cornerstone of Jewish religious life and thought, was compiled under Persian rule. Jewish communities had deep roots throughout Iran. They were merchants, scholars, physicians, artisans. They built synagogues that still stand today. They maintained traditions that went back to the days of exile. By some accounts, Iran's Jewish community was among the oldest continuous Jewish populations in the world. Older than most European Jewish communities by centuries, even in the modern era, that relationship persisted. Under the Pahlavi dynasty, which ruled Iran from 1925 to 1979, Iran and Israel were strategic partners, not secretly, openly. Iran was the second Muslim-majority country to recognize the State of Israel after it was founded in 1948. Let that sink in. The second, while most of the Muslim world was boycotting, threatening, and attacking the new Jewish state, Iran reached across and said, "We see you." And it wasn't just diplomatic recognition on paper. The relationship had real depth. There were direct El Al flights from Tel Aviv to Tehran. Israeli tourists visited Persepolis, walking through the ruins of the empire that freed their ancestors thousands of years earlier. Iranian oil flowed through the Trans-Israel pipeline, a joint venture between Israeli and Iranian companies. Israeli agricultural experts helped modernize Iranian farming techniques. Israeli construction firms worked on Iranian infrastructure projects. Mossad, Israel's intelligence agency, helped train Savak, Iran's security service. The two nations cooperated on military technology and shared intelligence about common threats in the region. The cultural exchange was just as real. Iranian wrestlers competed in the Maccabiah Games in Tel Aviv in 1965. Israeli archaeologists excavated sites in Iran's Gilan province. There were Iranian book exhibits at Jerusalem book fairs in the 1960s. Iranian chess teams played in competitions hosted in Israel. People traveled between the two countries freely. Business relationships flourished. There was nothing hidden about it. For Iran's Jewish community, this was a golden era. Nearly 100,000 Jews lived in the country in the 1970s. They served in government and held prominent positions in business and medicine. Synagogues operated freely in Tehran, Isfahan, Shiraz, and other cities. Jewish schools educated children in both Persian and Hebrew. Kosher food was available. Community life was vibrant. It wasn't paradise. The Shah's regime had its own brutalities that affected everyone. But for the Jewish community specifically, it was a level of integration and acceptance that had deep historical roots going back to the days of Cyrus and Esther. The relationship between Iran and Israel during this period was built on shared strategic interests. Both nations were non-Arab powers in a predominantly Arab region. Both felt surrounded by potential hostility. Both valued their relationship with the United States, and both benefited from the trade, intelligence sharing, and military cooperation that flowed between them. It was practical. It was profitable. And for many people on both sides, it felt natural, like something that had always been and always would be. And then February 1979 happened. The Islamic Revolution swept Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini into power. The Shah fled. The monarchy that had ruled for over half a century collapsed in a matter of weeks. And the transformation wasn't just political, it was total, ideological, spiritual, cultural. Everything the Pahlavi regime had built, including its relationship with Israel, was dismantled almost overnight. Khomeini didn't just distance Iran from Israel. He made opposition to Israel a pillar of the new state's identity. He declared Israel an enemy of Islam. He called it the Little Satan, with America as the Great Satan. Within days of the revolution, the Israeli embassy in Tehran was shut down. The building was handed directly to the Palestine Liberation Organization. Yasser Arafat flew in and raised the Palestinian flag on the very spot where the Israeli flag had flown for decades. It was theater, but it was also theology. The new regime believed that Israel's existence was a spiritual offense, not just a political inconvenience. Khomeini established Quds Day, meaning Jerusalem Day, turning the last Friday of Ramadan into an annual rally calling for Israel's destruction. Every year since, the streets of Tehran have filled with demonstrators chanting burning flags and listening to speeches that frame the elimination of the Jewish state as a religious duty. This wasn't fringe activism. It was state policy, woven into the fabric of the Islamic Republic's identity from day one. For Iran's Jewish community, the change was devastating. Nearly 80,000 Jews lived in Iran before the revolution. Most fled in the years that followed. Those who remained, about 10,000 to 25,000 depending on the period, found themselves in a strange position. Tolerated as a protected religious minority under Iranian law, but living under a government that called for the destruction of the world's only Jewish state. Their synagogues stayed open, their schools continued, but the golden age was over. But here's something most people don't know. The full break didn't happen as cleanly as the rhetoric suggested. Behind the scenes, even after the revolution, covert ties persisted between the two countries. When Iraq invaded Iran in 1980, launching a devastating 8-year war that killed an estimated 1 to 2 million people, Iran was desperate for weapons and military supplies. Its newly revolutionary army had been purged of experienced officers. Its Western supply chains had been severed. It was isolated and outgunned. Israel quietly stepped in. Not out of love, but out of calculation. Israel saw Saddam Hussein's Iraq as the more immediate threat. A strong Iraq was dangerous. A weakened Iran fighting Iraq was strategically useful. So Israel sold weapons to Iran, spare parts for American-made aircraft, ammunition, military equipment. Israeli Defense Minister Ariel Sharon publicly acknowledged it in 1982. Meanwhile, Iran denied the relationship, ridiculed Israel at the United Nations, and continued calling for its destruction. Public enemies, private partners, ideology in the streets, pragmatism in the back rooms. In 1987, while the war was still raging, Israeli Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin said something remarkable. He said Iran was Israel's best friend and that Israel had no intention of changing its position toward Tehran because Khomeini's regime would not last forever. He was wrong about that last part. But the statement reveals just how reluctant Israel was to let the relationship die, even after the revolution. The real turning point came in 1988, when the Iran-Iraq war finally ended. With the existential military threat removed, Iran no longer needed Israel's backdoor support. The revolutionary government turned its full attention to exporting its ideology, particularly into Lebanon, where Hezbollah was already taking shape as Iran's most important proxy, a military and political force built from the ground up to threaten Israel's northern border. Iran provided funding, training, weapons, and strategic direction. Hezbollah became in many ways an extension of Iranian power. Through the 1990s and 2000s, the hostility deepened layer by layer. Iran funded Hamas, it supported Palestinian Islamic Jihad, it armed the Houthis in Yemen. It built a network of allied militias across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and beyond. Military analysts call it the axis of resistance. All of these groups share at least one thing in common: opposition to Israel. Then came the nuclear program. Iran began developing nuclear capabilities that Israel and its allies viewed as an existential threat. The shadow war escalated. Assassinations of Iranian nuclear scientists, cyber attacks like the Stuxnet virus, Israeli strikes on Iranian targets in Syria, Iranian missile shipments intercepted at sea. Two nations that once exchanged tourists and trade now exchange threats and covert operations. And so here we are, two nations that the Bible remembers as allies, locked in one of the most dangerous rivalries on earth. But here's what's worth sitting with. The current conflict between Iran and Israel is real. It's dangerous. Lives are at stake. No one should romanticize the past or pretend that history alone can solve the problems of the present. The regime in Tehran has made its position clear, and the consequences of that position are felt across the entire Middle East. But the Bible offers a longer view, and the longer view tells a different story. It tells us that the land we call Iran was once the instrument of Israel's salvation. That Persian gold rebuilt God's temple. That Persian decrees restored God's people. That a Persian queen risked her life to stop a genocide. That a Persian king wept through the night because he didn't want a Jewish prophet to die. That Persian wise men crossed a continent to worship a Jewish baby they believed was the king of the world. It tells us that God is not limited by the politics of any era. He moved the heart of Cyrus when nobody asked him to. He moved the heart of Darius when the original decree was lost in the archives. He moved the heart of Artaxerxes when a cupbearer showed up to work with tears on his face. He positioned Esther in a palace years before the crisis that would require her courage. He guided the Magi by a star across 1,000 miles of desert. Every single time, God used people who didn't fully understand what they were doing, kings who didn't know him, wise men from a foreign religion, a queen who had to be reminded of her own identity. And every single time the result was the same: deliverance, restoration, worship, life. The hostility between Iran and Israel is 46 years old. The biblical friendship between Persia and Israel is over 2,500 years old. That doesn't make the current crisis less real, but it does make it less permanent. Because if the Bible teaches us anything, it's that God can change the trajectory of nations in a single generation. He can raise up a Cyrus where nobody expects one. He can put an Esther in a palace nobody is watching. He can send wise men from the last place anyone would look. Cyrus didn't choose to be God's Messiah. Esther didn't choose to be born in Persia. Daniel didn't choose to be taken to Babylon. The Magi didn't choose which star would rise over Bethlehem. But God positioned every one of them, and through every one of them, he accomplished something that nobody on earth could have planned. The story between these two peoples isn't finished. It can't be. Because the God who wrote the first chapters doesn't abandon his plots. He doesn't lose track of his characters. He doesn't forget the threads he's been weaving since before Cyrus drew his first breath. And if we're being honest, the current situation looks impossible. There is no diplomatic path visible, no peace process on the table, no goodwill between the governments. The leaders of Iran have built their identity around opposition to Israel. The leaders of Israel view Iran as an existential threat. Both sides have drawn lines they say they'll never cross, and yet both sides keep crossing them. But impossible is kind of God's specialty. Wasn't it impossible for a nation of slaves to walk out of Egypt? Wasn't it impossible for a teenager in a foreign court to outlast 4 kings? Wasn't it impossible for a people who had been in captivity for 70 years to go home? Every single one of those impossibilities was resolved, and every single time the resolution came from a direction nobody expected. From Persia, from Iran. And if he could call a Persian king my anointed 2,500 years ago, the same God who named him before he existed, the same God who grasped him by the right hand though he did not know him, that God is still sovereign over every throne in Tehran and every government in Jerusalem. The people of Iran are not the regime that governs them. The Bible makes that distinction clear. God didn't choose Persia because its government was righteous. He chose it because he's God and he can use anyone. The Iranian people have a heritage that stretches back to Cyrus, to Esther's court, to the Magi who followed a star. That heritage doesn't disappear because of a revolution. It's written in their land. It's recorded in their history. It's preserved in a book that has outlasted every empire that ever tried to suppress it. The world sees Iran and Israel and sees an unsolvable conflict. But the Bible sees something else. It sees a God who has a history of turning enemies into instruments of grace, and he has a way of doing it when absolutely no one sees it coming.